So we got Sabobi now as well. Welcome, man. I think we have recording on. So from now on, anything you say will be part of the public. Part of the public.
All right, I'll stop spilling secrets then.
Told Konstantin about the call as well, but looks like we got a little group now. We could maybe slowly start if you guys feel like it. Or should we wait a few minutes?
I think we may as well jump in. We're 6 on the mark.
Yeah, so the agenda for today, I posted it in the Ren chat text channel. So what we'll do is Long will give a couple of awesome updates about Greycore and host-to-host. And you guys in the community, you're free to ask any questions, and maybe Long can answer them, or maybe we have to keep some secrets or something. And then after that, we'll have a little chat about the community fund, which is now, it has funds for the first time. And we want to get those active, have you guys govern and manage those funds. So we'll chat about that. And then any other questions you guys have, we can chat about it. So yeah, I think.
Yeah, cool. I guess I'll jump in then. So I mean, I think everyone's I think everyone's had the chance to read the latest dev update, which kind of covers, I guess, the real core of the latest work that we've done. So I guess the two main things there in that update, or I guess one of the reasons why that update was such a big one for us, is that it really contains 2 of the biggest steps that we've taken in the last few months that we've kind of been building up towards and really prepping for. One being, of course, moving towards a Greycore and testnet. So sending out instructions to the first people who are going to start spinning up nodes, and then really sort of giving that process a kick. So this is quite a slow rollout for a couple of reasons. The first is that, this is, I mean, the recent, I guess, attacks on various cross-chain networks in the last few months has made it pretty clear that someone's out for everyone in that particular space. And security updates get much harder to push once you even have just a handful of people in different time zones. And some of these security issues can be, hypercritical kinds of issues that, if you find them, you need to get them patched pretty much instantly. So we're taking a slow approach where we're basically inviting one Greycore member at a time. So we send out instructions to one person, work with them to spin up a node on testnet, get them familiar with the process, and then essentially try and attack their node and see, make sure that everything is set up correctly and that the network is not too upset by the attack. And then if that all goes smoothly, we will take any feedback from that person about, I guess, the process and whether it was hard, whether it was easy, what can be improved. And then we do that, and then we roll it out to the next person. And we sort of just go like this on hopefully a weekly basis. And then, not too slowly, but on sort of that week by week increment, we can get it out to everyone on testnet. And then once things are running there smoothly, we'll leave it there for a little while, go through at least one security patch and one sort of major network upgrade, just so we can test that process and get all of the Greycore members familiar with it, and just make sure that it does in fact roll out smoothly, so we can, have at least one upgrade under our belt before we go to mainnet. And then of course we will switch over to mainnet, and we'll do the same thing there. So we'll invite those members through in the same kind of order, get them up on mainnet one by one, and then we'll be sort of at that very next major phase of decentralization of the network. And I think everything just kind of rolls out from there in a fairly obvious way. That's the Greycore side of things. Then the other super exciting part of that update was of course the host-to-host transactions. So this is, for anyone who's not familiar with that, we call it host-to-host because generally in RenVM, a chain can be one of 2 things. We say it's either a source chain or it's a host chain. We call it a host because it's kind of, hosting other assets from other people, other chains rather. So, for example, you can send Bitcoin to Ethereum, but you can't send an asset that's native to Ethereum, like DAI, for example, somewhere else. It's still stuck there for now. But what this enables, host-to-host transactions enable, is that these host chains can actually start interacting with each other in a very direct way. So if you think about, Avalanche and Ethereum, or Ethereum and Solana, they'll start getting to send their native assets between each other. So you'll start seeing assets like Ren USDC on other chains, or Ren ETH on other chains, Ren Sol on other chains, for example. So that's now rolled out to testnet, and we're giving it a kick there. Again, just making sure that everything is working, running our testing suite, and once everything's been running smoothly there for a little while, we'll then announce, I guess, the initial list of assets that we plan to support, and we'll post it on mainnet, and then people will be able to start, I guess, building a whole set of new interesting applications. There's all kinds of there's all these different, maybe you want to call them stable assets, that are kind of backed by other assets, whether it's Ren BTC and WBTC, or whether it's like these wrapping projects, or you've got all these different stable coins on all these different chains, and a clear application that's surfaced as being to be valuable has been applications like Curve. And so being able to develop like these cross-chain versions of that, where you might have one asset on one chain and it's exactly the same category of asset on another chain, and you can start doing arbitrage between them, and making sure that they're sort of priced approximately similarly, making sure that if anyone wants to go from one asset to the other, they can, even if the asset is fundamentally the same. So an example, of course, being, I think every chain essentially has its own native synthetic US dollar at this stage. So that's a good example of what I mean by that. So those are really the two major things. I might pause there and see if anyone has any questions.
Hi there. I actually have a question, Ella. I was wondering regarding the Greycore members, how many will there be when you basically move over to mainnet? Is it like their plan to be just like 1, 2, just to keep it secure, or is there a specific benchmark you want to reach before you deploy them on mainnet?
So we've got a sort of a pre approved list of Greycore candidates. I think it's about a dozen strong, if I recall correctly, and not necessarily all of them may not make it over to mainnet. For example, if we bring one of those operators on and they're too slow to upgrade, or we run attacks against their node and it's too easy to break it, then we may find ourselves excluding them from the mainnet rollout. But that's really our benchmark at this stage.
Okay, and just to make sure I understand correctly, so once Greycore has been migrated to mainnet, at that point the Ren team is no longer in control, and it's the Greycore members who will be in control of the funds, or?
Yeah, so there are two phases. So there are two phases. So the network is kind of separated into, I guess, two groups under the hood. One is the consensus group, and one is the execution groups. And so this is the first stage of the Greycore rollout. So they'll only be in charge of consensus. So they're essentially deciding what transactions are getting processed in what order. This is quite a critical coordination aspect of the chain, and there are some attacks that do become theoretically possible. But then there's the actual execution nodes, which are the ones ultimately custodying the assets, and they revalidate everything that the core chain does. So you can kind of think of them like clients to a standard blockchain. So you have all of these validators producing blocks, and in principle they're able to produce invalid blocks or invalid transactions that don't make any sense. But as long as the clients are actually validating the blocks as they come in, the worst that can do is essentially stall the chain. And have all the clients be like, this block doesn't make sense, or these transactions don't make sense, so I'm not going to execute them. But they can't sort of propose what transactions will get executed. So that's essentially what's going to be in place once we get to mainnet, is that consensus system will be in control of third parties, and then the second phase is to move execution over.
Okay, and the same rollout plan will apply when all nodes will participate. So afterwards,
yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we'll go through that same process where we'll go through a 1x1 on testnet to roll out the execution, and then we'll go through a 1x1 introduction to mainnet.
Okay, nice. And the second question was regarding the host-to-host, which is kind of related to most things actually. I was wondering, will there be more details in regards to speed capacity around RenVM, especially now since with host-to-host, we're going to have pretty fast chains being able to communicate with each other? So let's say like Arbitrum to Solana. Do we know any details on basically what the capacity is on RenVM and how high it can go? And how seamless will the interaction between fast chains be?
Yeah, so I mean, in its present design, there is sort of a bottleneck. It's hard to get a good estimate for how much throughput we can really expect, because it's to do with batching. So RenVM will kind of batch transactions that happen near each other, or essentially that happen in one RenVM block. So under the hood, RenVM essentially runs its own blockchain and puts transactions into blocks. And all the transactions it has in one block kind of get batched together, and this helps it be a little bit more efficient. So it's hard to give an exact estimate, but we're talking at this stage maybe hundreds per second approximately, which I think should be good enough initially. I don't think we're anywhere near that kind of number at this stage, but we actually do have a design for how to make that scale much better. And essentially the way that design works is that at the moment RenVM signs every single transaction, whereas what you can instead do is you can bundle all of those transactions together and put them into like a Merkle tree, and then you can sign only the root of the Merkle tree. And then when you go to mint an asset, you provide the root signature and you provide a little path to your transaction to kind of prove that it was included in that setup. And using that, you can scale to huge throughput. Not as much as Solana can, but more than enough to manage the kind of cross-chain transaction volume that you might expect. Yeah. And if we find that we're hitting our limits earlier than we anticipate, then we will just simply, I guess, accelerate how quickly we plan to go through with that kind of design.
Yeah, I mean, as long as the possibility is there to increase capacity at a later stage should be good, because I wouldn't expect too much in the beginning, but eventually when, arbitrage bots and stuff start popping up, those capacities might be reached at a later stage. And I was wondering, because I was reading this Uniswap post about their launch on Arbitrum, and they were saying that to release, basically withdraw from Arbitrum, there was a 7-day withdrawal period. That's not going to apply to RenVM, right?
That's correct. So RenVM is only going to have Ren assets that are moving off Arbitrum through RenVM. They'll just go through the standard sort of finality within Arbitrum.
Do you know why Uniswap has to go through that 7-day stage and not RenVM?
So that's because of the way that finality, I guess, propagates from Arbitrum up into Ethereum. So the general principle that RenVM tries to apply is that it isolates assets on a chain-by-chain basis. And so it treats each chain as sort of like a single failure mode. So if you move your assets to Arbitrum and you're happy with our Arbitrum security model, then if the Arbitrum chain gets attacked and ultimately fails, then only the people that are actually trying to put assets in Arbitrum and use assets there are going to be affected. So in some sense, users have fundamentally chosen their own risk, and to some degree, this is inescapable. RenVM can't make a chain more secure than that chain is in and of itself. With L2s, there is this subtle difference where Arbitrum has a level of its own security, and then it kind of piggybacks off Ethereum security, and that's where that gap, that delay kind of comes in. Is that there needs to be enough time. If something goes wrong on Arbitrum, you can kind of prove that it went wrong by submitting a fraud proof to Ethereum, and you need this delay to be long enough that people in general have a chance to submit that fraud proof to Ethereum and sort of prove that something went wrong. And if that gap is only an hour, then it's not too hard to DOS the network for a 1-hour period to prevent people, or if there's some kind of crazy event like we've seen happen a couple of times earlier in the year in March, for example, when we had all of those liquidations and the chain, like a lot of these arbitrage bots kind of failed and the chain got incredibly busy. And a lot of Oracle started failing as well. You don't want that kind of situation where you've got these sort of fraud-proving bots monitoring the chain and things get too busy for too long and they're unable to submit proofs. So that's why they have this big, long 1-week window. So the caveat here is that you don't get the protection of Ethereum when you're on Arbitrum. Now, you do if you're just handling the assets, but you don't if you move the assets over across the chain, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I follow. So basically when you move from Arbitrum through RenVM to whichever chain, you don't go through the same process as basically proving on Ethereum as well. It's basically just removing the L1 Ethereum part and just direct connection with Arbitrum to RenVM, which basically would mean that someone would be able, if someone doesn't want to go through that 7-day stage, they could just use RenVM to go from Arbitrum to Ethereum without the 7 days, right?
Yes, assuming that the liquidity is there.
Yeah, of course. Okay, that's actually interesting. I
So
wonder.
you could have like Ren ETH. So there'll be a Ren ETH on Arbitrum, and then you can sort of, if you had ETH on Arbitrum, you could go into a curve pool and get Ren ETH, and then take the Ren ETH off of Ethereum and get it back on ETH, and you could do that much faster than 7 days.
That's actually pretty interesting. And yeah, I think I actually have a few more questions, but I think I save them for later because these two were host to host and smart Greycore related, so I don't take too much space.
I've got a question from the community. They wanted to know, are there any specific requirements for Greycore members to hold a specific amount of Ren tokens or to run a specific amount of Ren dark nodes?
So at this stage, we're only allowing Greycore members to run a single dark node. Because of the way that the selection of Greycore members works, the idea of having sort of a Ren stake doesn't really make economic sense. So we're not making it a requirement because it is something that's, you have to meet a certain set of, ecosystem requirements that kind of preclude that stake really meaning anything. So part of the biggest requirement is essentially that this people running these nodes have to be, big players in the ecosystem. I understand that that's a very subjective measure, so which is why this is still a semi-centralized stage of the project, because there has to be some level of discretion and subjectivity to that decision making. But a good example is, groups like BadgerDAO, for example, who are, their own ecosystem leverages the Ren ecosystem heavily. So the project is naturally incentivized to keep RenVM safe to a large degree, because if they didn't do so, their own ecosystem would collapse. And in some sense, their ecosystem is their stake. Curve is another interesting example where, there's a huge amount of Ren BTC liquidity sitting inside Curve. And so, people who are heavily embedded in the Curve community would be messing themselves up if they were to compromise the network. So this is kind of the criteria that we're using.
Makes sense, thanks. I've got another question. When the dark nodes will handle the consensus, we had like two different plans, if I remember correctly. One was to stick with Greycore existence, and the second was to pass everything to the community. What is our current plan? Do we stick with dark nodes when mainnet 0 hits, or what?
So when you mean dark nodes, are you talking about like the difference between community dark nodes and Greycore dark nodes?
Yes.
Right. So the current plan is to still have kind of a dual signature approach. So essentially, the idea is that when it comes to consensus, it doesn't actually matter, because the way that we've implemented it is that execution can pre-validate everything that happens at the consensus layer. So the consensus can't really, as I mentioned before, can't really trick execution into doing anything that it shouldn't be doing. And so at the execution layer, in principle, what will happen is there will always be two signatures required, which is one from the Greycore and one from the shard itself, and that there are several shards. How that essentially disappears is that the community will be able to govern who is in that Greycore, so that that decision-making power is not, centrally controlled and just becomes a natural part of governance. And part of that is the right to sort of add members and remove members. And so in principle, governance could simply just vote to remove every single member from the Greycore, and what you'd be left with is you'd be left with a single signature version. And so, but at any point, the community could then vote to bring a member back into the Greycore if they so desired.
So how would the community members be able to permissionlessly kick people off from Greycore? Because we can't we can't force them to shut off their software.
So you actually can. there's a rate limit at which you would be able to remove them. So you wouldn't be able to remove more than 1/3 of the Greycore members at a time. But as long as you're removing less than one at a time, then when the shards rotate, you can rotate all of the key holders, and that person, like, doesn't matter what that party is doing, they'll get kicked out. So even if they don't shut up the node, then they'll just be running a node for no reason that everyone's kind of ignoring, essentially.
Yeah, but could that be done through like a voting mechanism, like using Ren tokens?
Yes,
How would that actually?
Yeah, so this could be instituted through a sort of standard voting mechanism.
Okay, cool. That was actually one of my questions, so I'm glad Arvi asked it. Does anyone else have any questions about Greycore host to host? You can request to speak. Oh yeah, Sabovi, go
Sorry,
ahead.
I have one more question regarding the host to host. I was wondering regarding the user experience. So at the moment, when we have this RenBridge user experience where we have the gateway address that we send the BTC to and so on, it's pretty straightforward. But I was thinking with the host to host, when we're going to have wallets such as Phantom on one chain and then MetaMask on the other chain, how will the user experience be between those two chains? Like, do we have to sign on one side and then go and sign on the other side? Or is there any way to just have to kind of just sign one signature that approves on both chains?
So under the hood, you will have to sign, like the way that RenVM works is that you will have to sort of approve two transactions, one transaction that locks up your funds on one chain and then another transaction that unlocks your funds on the other chain, or sort of mints your funds rather on the other chain, which is essentially the same way that it works presently, right? Where, you know, when you transfer Bitcoin, you're essentially signing a transaction with your wallet. However, because most host chains have generic smart contract capabilities, you can build these wrapper contracts that sort of forward up the locking, so that the locking actually happens from a contract as opposed to from a person's signature directly. And likewise, on the other side, on the receiving chain, you can have a contract that does the minting for you, and then those contracts themselves can basically be written in such a way that they are identifying who the funds belong to based on one single signature. So it can be done in that way, and you would essentially be, what's the right way to phrase it? It's essentially like a wrapper around RenVM's sort of natural or native way of doing it, and anyone could build this however they wanted. So there's some level of, you know, user discretion where they have to make sure that this is being done properly and they're not interacting with a malicious contract. But this is, I mean, already generally the case. But then there's also, I know that there's a group that's working on meta transactions, which, you know, I know this has been a concept that's been thrown around for a couple of years now in the blockchain space, which is essentially that you have these third-party transaction relays that are paying your gas for you, essentially, and that there's a way to do this in such a way that these third-party service providers aren't, you know, they can't compromise the integrity of your transaction in any way. At worst, they can just choose not to submit it. Didn't really take off. I think there is a chance for that kind of service to really be very valuable in a way that it hasn't been up till now, because up till now, most people interact with only one chain at a time. And so the value proposition of managing gas is not actually that high. Whereas when you're talking about potentially interacting with multiple chains simultaneously, suddenly this kind of service provision becomes very much worth it. And the other interesting thing is that because it's always in the context of an asset moving from one chain to another, there is always an underlying asset from which the service provider can remunerate themselves, right? So they say, well, I've got to pay for a little bit of gas on the ETH side, and I've got to pay for a little bit of gas on the Solana side. I'll do that for you, but when that Bitcoin moves, I'm going to take just enough Bitcoin to cover my losses on the gas, and then maybe a little bit extra to sort of incentivize me to provide this service at all.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I was thinking as well, when we get to the stage where you would have multi-hops, so basically have one transaction where you go through several chains and perform different actions on all those chains. So I'm assuming it would be the same principle there as you just explained.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the other advantage of that is right now, you know, anyone who's used RenBridge will be familiar with this sort of UX where you transfer your assets to the gateway address, and then you kind of have to come back an hour later once all the confirmations are in place and then go through the next stage of the transaction. if there's a meta service provider, they do that for you automatically. So you don't really have to come back to make sure the transaction does undergo the next stage of execution. So you can just kind of provide Bitcoin as liquidity to a DEX that's sitting on Solana, but your Bitcoin was currently sitting on Ethereum. You could initiate that transaction and then walk away and then come back the next day. It would have already been placed into that. You'd already be providing that liquidity. You wouldn't sort of miss out on that opportunity cost of the time that you've been away from your machine. So it's kind of a bit of a hidden benefit.
And could that eventually lead to a point where we don't need to submit anything when we interact with the bridge? So basically that's
you always, yeah. So the way that the signatures work is that you always need to at least sign something, because that's how contracts are usually set up with these meta transaction providers, to ensure that the meta transaction provider can't change what you claimed your intent was, and then steal your money or do something nefarious with it. And in the cases of some chains like Bitcoin, which have very weak scripting capabilities, you'll still have to do a transaction that's actually submitted to the gateway. So in some sense, you'll always need to do an explicit interaction with your wallet, but generally speaking, you'll only need to do one, and then no matter what it was that you were trying to do, everything can kind of be kicked off and managed for you.
Nice. And is this something that would need to be implemented by the Ren team, or how is it for like third-party developers to jump in and start run these things and basically do it on their own without you guys being involved?
Yeah, so I mean, we explicitly don't want to be involved in that, for the reason that we kind of have our hands full with the core protocol, but we also want to be able to encourage these sorts of third-party service providers to be built on top of Ren and really sort of help create this ecosystem. I am aware of at least one group that's doing this and trying to build this. And the Ren team will obviously provide as much help as we can to any team that is trying to build something on RenVM, regardless of what it is. But there is, I won't pretend that there isn't a lot more we could do in the way of documentation and tutorials and examples in terms of how to help developers understand how to interact with our system. But at the end of the day, it's the RenVM part of meta transactions is not especially complicated.
And all this boils down to interaction with RenGS SDK, or is there any other component that developers need to be considering to look into and so on?
Beyond the standard things that someone who's building a meta transaction service provider would need to consider, interacting with RenJS is pretty much the only other component. Using it to monitor gateway addresses, and then potentially building their own interface, so that their own UI, so that the transactions flow through their provider. We may one day make it such that if there is sort of one meta transaction provider that really takes off and becomes king, we might think about integrating with Ren Bridge, but we're generally trying to keep Bridge as agnostic to different service providers as possible, so that we don't play favorites and create centralization around certain third-party service providers. But the Ren Bridge is intentionally designed to be easy to fork and easy to extend. So I would imagine that anyone who's creating such a service will simply fork Ren Bridge, and then instead of forwarding all the transactions to RenVM directly, they would sort of proxy it through their own system. And in fact, I think the ZeroDAO or Zero Confirmation team actually already implemented this. So there's already a sort of standing open source implementation of what it looks like to have a proxy layer that sits between Ren Bridge and sort of RenJS SDK and RenVM's network proper.
Okay, cool. So in the Ren Bridge, basically when host-to-host is activated, let's say we want to send from Ethereum to Solana, one would need to connect their MetaMask, do their part on the Ethereum side with MetaMask, and then also connect the Phantom or another Solana wallet, and then do the same thing on the destination chain and sign and all that, right?
That's correct. Yeah. For now, that's going to be the opening experience.
With the capacity for any third party like ZeroDAO and so on to improve that and kind of abstract it away to make it more seamless for the users. And okay, perfect. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
Mr. Rank, you wanted to ask a question, I think.
Hello. I wanted to ask if someone was moving like a ERC20 from Avalanche to Phantom, what would the fee be paid in?
The fee would be paid in whatever the ERC20 is.
Okay. And the second question I wanted to know is, would it be possible to have a different fee structure for moving stable coins compared to other generic tokens? Would they all have to have the same fee?
Each asset on each chain is able to have a distinct fee associated with it. Yeah. Okay, so, for example, with more stable assets, you could make that fee lower or higher.
Okay. Yeah.
And if anyone has any questions, you can also write in the Gov chat, and I can read up the questions.
I think Mag has his hand up.
Yeah, I sent a message to Mag, but I sort of want to vet people beforehand that I don't know.
Fair enough.
I mean, we can try. See. And Marcus, DMV, your mic, you're muted right now. You can.
Hi, can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Sorry, what's mute?
Hi, Mike.
Hi, everyone. Yes, just my question is around with the expansion of the Greycore. I just want to understand how intense is being the supervision of the network for the Greycore nodes. If there is any critical point in where these nodes that are going to be run by these third parties, if they don't fulfill the actions, if there is some kind of risk for the network in terms of transactions that may not run or any other type of issues that you might have experienced while you were running the Greycore nodes?
So because the initial expansion is only around the consensus mechanism, if Greycore nodes are behaving maliciously or if they go offline for an extended period of time, or enough of them are offline for an extended period of time that the network can't make progress, it is possible to have an out-of-band network upgrade that kind of, I guess, drops the Greycore and adopts a new one. It's a pretty messy process, but it can be done in principle, and no funds would be at risk when that process happens. And you can implement a similar-ish style strategy even once execution is handled by the Greycore. Obviously, if the Greycore is effectively is able to be malicious enough that it can steal the funds, there's nothing you can do about that, and that's kind of, I guess, the risk of expansion. But if the nodes are attacked or they go offline, they become unavailable, you can have a secondary key that is kind of like a fail-safe admin key that only kicks in after an extended period of time. So, for example, the shards rotate, or they will be rotating every 24 hours. And then you could have a key that says after a week, this secondary key kicks in and can move the funds. Now, obviously, if the funds are rotating every day as they should be, then that key never becomes active and it can never be used to move the funds. But if the network goes down through some liveliness failure, whether that's malicious or not, then, worst case scenario is that people's funds aren't accessible for 1 week, and then the network can undergo an out-of-band fail-safe recovery. Does that answer your question?
You're muted, Mike.
Hi. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome.
We have a question from Marcus, who's wondering how secret enclaves fit together with Greycore, if they're gonna already be trying out our secret enclave.
So the secret enclaves, so the secret enclaves won't be an immediate part of the Greycore. That could change pretty rapidly. The primary issue is that there are certain what's the easiest way to explain this? There are certain very low-level instructions that all the code gets turned into that aren't actually accessible when you're inside an SGX environment. And for the most part, most code don't use those instructions. However, one of the libraries that we depend on because of the Cosmos ecosystem actually turns out that it does have one of these weird esoteric instructions in it that makes it not possible for that subsection of the network to run with inside an SGX. Now we're in the process of actually upgrading our Cosmos dependency to the latest one, which has a large number of changes. And it could well be the case that there isn't this odd esoteric instruction. If it's still there, there is a strategy for how we can eventually remove it so that we can put everything inside the SGX proper. But that kind of acts as like a blocker at this point for putting everything onto the SGX straight out of the gate.
I'm assuming that Marcus was happy about that answer. I was as well. We have more questions. What's the incentives for Greycore members? Since I mean they might not be earning a lot of fees if they're only running one node. What's the high for them?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why we've sort of made it a criteria that all of these interest group, so they have some dependency incentive to want to see, you know, the sort of small initial group that we plan on working with. Then it could be the case that we create, you know, two fee structures where, you know, some portion of the fees, maybe 2/3 or 1/3 or whatever it is, gets reserved for the public nodes, and then some other portion gets reserved specifically for the Greycore, so they get kind of like a boost. Maybe the way to think about it is that, you know, it could be the case that these nodes actually earn, you know, 10x what a normal node would earn, so that there's an improved incentive to actually continue participating honestly, because you get a substantial number of fees. At this stage, the nodes will still receive the standard sort of fee income that normal nodes earn, so they're not somehow not earning that, but they don't have some additional direct monetary incentive.
Cool. Mr. Moonbags is wondering about the security issues that were found. Is that something you could put some color on, or?
Yeah, so that's something that we will disclose in sort of a more full report on exactly what we found and how we found it and what we did to fix it. But it's not something that we are in a position where we want to discuss that publicly yet. So the nature of finding security issues is that generally you want to obviously fix them and get those fixes out, which we have now done. But generally what happens is when you find a bug of this nature, it's something that is categorizable. So it's kind of like a particular category of bug, a certain type of attack, and you discover essentially one of those types of attacks. And then what you want to do is you want to go through the code base very carefully, very precisely, and make sure no other bugs of that kind exist. And if there are other bugs of that kind, you can find them and fix them. So we found two potential security issues in the system of two completely different categories. And so we've gone through, or we've fixed those, and we're now in the process of going through and ensuring that there are no others of either of those types of categories. One of those categories turned out to be completely inert, in the sense that it was kind of a potential security issue, but we couldn't find any way in which it actually would have been an issue for NVM. The other was non-inert, so it could have been an issue for NVM. It is in theory possible for someone to have exploited that issue to some degree. Once we've kind of built up a level of confidence that there are no more of this sort of category of attack, then we can sort of publish the details of that category of attack. You could kind of understand why you don't want to do that preemptively, because then you make it known that this type of attack was possible and potentially is still possible, and then you attract a lot of unwanted attention. And if you haven't gone through and made sure that the system is fully locked down, then you open yourself up to unnecessary risk.
Nice. We have a few more questions. Fuzzy Logic is wondering what's with 24-hour shard rotation? Why specifically that interval?
24 hours gives everyone time to come back to their transaction pretty much no matter where they are in the world. So if you're trying to coordinate around the world, 24 hours covers every single time zone. If you pick something like 8 hours, then you could end up in this kind of awkward circumstance where you need to do something at night and then you want to go to sleep. Then it kind of becomes a little bit difficult. So you want something as short and as quick as possible, but you also want to allow people enough time to deal with something. So if you're moving any substantial amount of funds around and you're not willing to wrap it up within 24 hours, there is a sort of a failure mode in the sense that if you initiate a transaction against an address, that address is valid for at least 24 hours. In principle, it's valid for up to 48 hours, but it depends on where you come in to the 24-hour period. And then there's sort of once you've sent the funds to that address, the address remains valid for an additional 24 hours in case something goes wrong. But essentially, it's just a time zone thing. You want to make sure that doing it in sort of intervals of 24 hours means that no matter when someone begins this process, you guarantee there's going to be a period in which they're awake and reasonable in order to progress the transaction.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense to me. Jamlog's wondering when third parties could expect to, or when we can expect third parties to be able to build applications that live inside RenVM.
Far enough away that I don't have a definitive answer to that question. It'll be at least 6 months before we begin trialing it with any developers, because it requires a significant changes to RenVM. But it is something that we are very close to. We've been in the process of exploring that design space and working with different designs, criticizing them and going through that process. Very soon we'll be able to start building prototypes. Obviously the Greycore expansion is one of these key features that I would say is still necessary for us to call RenVM complete in any way. But it's interesting because it's not a feature that requires much development time. It just requires waiting and sort of talking to people and getting feedback and making tweaks. It's not, like full-time development effort being required. So we can start shifting our focus to building prototypes and actually experimenting with what different models of building application layer, so to speak, on top of RenVM will actually look like. But that is a process that is still very experimental at this stage, not in the sense that we don't know whether it's possible. We are very, very confident that it is absolutely possible. It's just that there are so many different ways to approach it. We want to really explore all of the options. And we'll probably start posting some of what those options look like to the community so we can get feedback from anyone that is technically inclined, that wants to sort of weigh in on which of these design trade-offs they think would be good or bad.
Cool. And last question before we move to the next point of the agenda. What if Greycore members decided to leave without sort of anyone's consent? Like they just shut off their node and left. How would we?
So if as long as less than 1/3 do it within a single within a failure period, probably 24 hours. For the same reasons that we just discussed before. In case it's accidental, 24 hours gives them enough time to be awake at some point to fix the issue. As long as less than 1/3 of the Greycore is doing this, then the system will just naturally recover. It'll just kick them out and carry on as usual. If more than 1/3 fail, then the system essentially grinds to a halt. As long as more than 1/3 are still around, you can still make sort of in-band progress. But you have to coordinate an internal upgrade. If more than 2/3 fail, then you have to do an out-of-band upgrade where you have to sort of shut the network down entirely, set up new configs, get a hold of all the Greycore members, and give them these updated configs. And this is one of the reasons why we want to go through a Greycore rollout first, is so that in case of these issues happen, the community of people running these nodes are small enough that you can reach out to each of them and say, hey guys, something went wrong. Can we please coordinate getting things back online? Whereas obviously if you're dealing with the 2,000 plus nodes that we have today, that becomes impossible to do. So we kind of rolling out to a smaller group first gives us that chance in case something does go wrong.
And if a Greycore member their node failed, they couldn't recover within 24 hours, but they're still good members. They want to get back in. What's the sort of process? Are you thinking about that at this stage?
That's interesting. I haven't actually considered that situation. I guess it'd be a multi-strike policy, right? I mean, if it happens more than once, I think we would probably want to keep them out of the network, even if they were, I guess, morally good. It means that they're not technically savvy enough to maintain their nodes uptime.
Yeah.
But for the record, I myself have been running these nodes on Greycore for a significant amount of time, and you don't need to touch them. We've put a lot of work into making sure that these nodes will automatically reboot, automatically recover. In fact, I've never seen my node reboot for any reason. So I'd be reasonably confident that this is going to be an intermittent issue on a very, very low scale if it's an issue at all.
And on this topic, we just made public a new repo on GitHub called nodectl. Do you want to provide some color to that? Like how?
Yes, node control. Yeah, that's what CTL stands for. Node control is just kind of an updated version of the node, the dark node CLI, which has a couple of very boring, esoteric changes that are required to help Greycore members' lives just be a little bit easier. So it's just the sort of next version of the dark node CLI, but it's also not compatible with the dark node CLI. So that's why it's got a different name to avoid people getting confused. So if you have a node that's running with the dark node CLI, you can just continue forever running it with the dark node CLI and you'll be fine. The node control upgrade is not so, it's got nothing to do with the dark node itself, just the mechanisms by which you interact with the dark node. If you ever did want to migrate, you would have to, at this stage, deregister your node and then re-register with node control. But node control is also not quite at that stage where we're ready to have 2,000 people yet. Again, that's why we're rolling out to Greycore members one at a time, so that if they do have any issues with node control, we're able to identify those, fix them before we move on to the next Greycore member. But once we roll out the Greycore, we'll probably node control, do some kind of public announcement and let people know that if they are so inclined, they can make that migration.
Would it be sort of recommended to switch over? Would it make it easier for community members to manage their dark nodes?
It certainly would be recommended for all new dark node operators coming online. But for existing ones, I don't think the upgrade is materially significant enough at this stage to warrant people doing it. That will change over time. After a year of development or more, certain features will creep into nodectl that won't creep into dark node CLI. And it'll slowly become more and more worthwhile. But it'll never be. I doubt that it'll ever be absolutely necessary for that kind of upgrade to happen.
Regarding those are two separate clients, right? So let's say that there was some bug in nodectl that didn't affect the regular dark node client. Would it be well advised that there's multiple? Some would be running the regular dark node client, some would be running nodectl, or would you want nodectl in different implementation languages?
So one of the reasons why we moved over to nodectl is nodectl is structured to better support the idea of random configurations of the dark nodes themselves, as opposed to sort of the more homogeneous deployments that dark node CLI is currently doing. But that is an interesting point, and it's kind of like a freebie, if you will. That is, while you've got these two clients running, you do have two standalone implementations. So a bug in one may not be a bug in both, and so you kind of have this. If the bug is in somehow how the dark node got deployed, there's some kind of misconfiguration that made it insecure. Then it may be that the bug is in both implementations, but it also may not be, which kind of potentially helps you keep half your network safe.
Great. So that's all the questions I can see. So I think we'll be moving over to the next agenda. So Long, thank you so much for answering all these technical questions. And since it's recorded, we'll have a lot of appreciation for this material. I think we'll post it everywhere. And I know it's late over at you, so if you want to leave now, I think that's fine, and we'll start chatting about the community treasury. But that's up to you.
No, it's a good.
Okay, so Jamlog is asking one more question about meta transactions. How does that work with other platforms like Solana and Cosmos that don't use EVM? Would you need separate or like double implementations for?
That's right. Yeah. So the meta transaction provider would need to make sure that they had an implementation for both an EVM-based chain and a Solana-based chain, or whichever chains they wanted to support. So meta transaction providers will, I would assume that they will start off supporting only EVM, and then will slowly expand to these more esoteric chains like Solana.
Great.